Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Jumpstart 2022, Agrus Kos, Eternal Soldier. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck text, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Agrus is a 3/4 Spirit Soldier with Vigilance for 3 generic and 1 white. However, since he has a triggered ability that requires 1 generic and 1 red-white hybrid mana to pay for, he has a red-white color identity. Speaking of, this triggered ability is absolutely busted along the same vein as Zadahedron Grinder. The only difference is that Agrus triggers off of abilities that trigger only him instead of instants and sorceries, which is definitely a breath of fresh air. This means that instead of instants and sorceries wanting to target Agrus, we want permanents that do it. When we do, we can pay 2 mana to have all of our creatures be targeted by said effect. Super busted. When building Agrus, I knew I wanted to do multiple things, seemingly at once. I know I wanted to go aggro while protecting my creatures in order to either break through Mexican standoffs via board wipes, turn one-sided, and or giving my creatures keyword soup. But I also wanted to make the absolute most of his ability, so I added ways to make the most of being in these colors. Them being blinking Agrus as well as copying him. So let's start with those before going to the main aggro strategies. Angel of Condemnation and Eldrazi Displacer only cost 3 mana to blink Agrus, with the former being a delayed blink effect and the latter being an immediately blink effect. What this means is that with the Angel of Condemnation, I can protect my board from a Wrath effect by exiling Agrus and paying 2 extra mana to target every other creature. Unfortunately, the Angel can't target itself. The Wrath effect resolves, and then at the beginning of the next end step, all of my creatures return. The Eldrazi is still amazing because it can be used to blink all of our creatures with enter the battlefield effects by just blinking Agrus and paying the 2 extra. So it's still amazing. These creatures can also target opponents' creatures, so it can deal with potential attackers as well as blockers too. They're amazing on their own. As for the copy effects, I'm running Mirror Pool, Fellhide Spirit Binder, Flame Rush Rider, Duke Ulder Raven Guard, Rionia Fire Dancer, and Jaxus the Troublemaker. These are also all great on their own, but even better when used with Agrus. The first one doesn't even take up a slot on the deck, but it does require some investment in mana. It costs 5 to activate as well as tap, so that's technically 6, plus it needs to be sacrificed, and then you need 2 more for Agrus' ability. However, the payoff is amazing since you're creating a token copy of all of your creatures, save for the legendary ones due to the legend rule. This one's also slightly better than the other 5, since the token copy created won't go away afterwards. Fellhide Spirit Binder also requires mana for its trigger, so combined with Agrus that'd be 4 mana. However, for 4 mana you can create a token copy with haste of all of your creatures. This is amazing for going for an alpha strike while still having the originals behind if you need to. Flame Rush Rider also does something similar, but you don't need mana for it. You just have to attack with it. However, you also need to be attacking with Agrus and any other creature you want to clone, since it only targets attacking creatures you control. Since it has dash, you can also sort of not telegraph what you're doing by dashing it in before entering combat, taking your opponents by surprise. Duke Ulder also creates token copies that are exiled at the beginning of the next end step, but this is even more busted since he's technically giving our creatures Myriad. So we're getting a token copy for each opponent that creature is attacking beyond the first. Since it requires no mana, we can just target Agrus with it, pay 2 mana, and then our entire board has Myriad. He's possibly one of the most busted combat effects in the deck. Rionia also does it for free and at the beginning of combat on our turn. The deck doesn't have many instants and sorceries, but since X is 1 plus that number, if we didn't cast any, we'd still get at least 1 token copy. If we did cast any beforehand, then it could really get out of hand, so she does some serious work here. Jaxus is amazing because not only does she create a token copy of all of our creatures, but they essentially have Blitz. So when that token dies, we draw a card. Not only that, but the token has to be sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. So she draws us into a ton of cards. We do have to discard a card to activate her, but it's well worth it given how many cards we can potentially draw into. While it might seem like a bummer to lose most of the token copies at the beginning of our end step, we can still make the most of them with cards like Over the Top. Yes, this counts a whopping 7 mana to cast, and we'd need at minimum 2 mana for Agrus if we are cloning our whole army. But since we'll have double or more of our creatures after cloning, we can potentially cheat into play a vast majority of the permanents in the deck. Since Agrus cares about being targeted by permanents, most of the cards in the deck are permanents. Now, I know that this card is symmetrical, but later on we'll see how we make the deck's wraths one-sided. Casting this after a one-sided wrath is also pretty backbreaking. It's almost better than drawing into a ton of cards. Speaking of, one final spicy card I want to mention for running in Agrus is Scarab of the Unseen. Jaxes will draw us into a ton of cards, but so will this artifact. Unfortunately, you do have to tap and sacrifice it, so it's really only usable once. But it's still amazing. Notice that it only targets the permanent we own with auras on it. However, we can target a permanent without auras on it, so we simply don't bounce any auras. However, within that same block of text, we draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, meaning that if we target Agrus with this ability and pay for his effect, we essentially draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep for each creature we control. This is definitely something opponents won't see coming, and honestly, they've more than likely never even seen nor heard about this card. So not only is it amazing in the deck, but also gets you those obscurity points. Now that we saw some interesting interactions in the making the most of going aggro via hasty temporary tokens, how are we going to make the most of those creatures we want to constantly be swinging in with? Let's start with ways of giving our creatures counters, since those are more permanent than until end of turn effects. Ajani Caller of the Pride, Ajani Inspiring Leader, Basriket, and Elspeth Resplendent are some of the deck's planeswalkers that can achieve this. While the deck is very aggro, it does have quite a few planeswalkers, but we'll see them as we go along. Ajani Caller of the Pride only costs 3 mana to cast and can put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature by gaining 1 loyalty. No mana investment means activating it and only paying 2 mana to copy it with Agrus, giving all of our creatures a +1/+1 counter for little to no effort. His -3 loyalty ability is also amazing here, since it can give all of our creatures flying and double strike until end of turn, so long as we target Agrus and pay 2 mana. Even his ultimate is useful, giving us a ton of 2/2 cat tokens, even though his first 2 abilities are the main reason for running him. Ajani Inspiring Leader might seem like a throwaway card from the Planeswalker decks, and yes, he costs a whopping 6 mana to cast, but his +2 loyalty ability is amazing here. Not only are we putting 2 +1/+1 counters on all of our creatures while targeting Agrus, but we're also getting 2 life per creature since Agrus is copying the whole ability. Amazing. His -3 loyalty ability is also great since it exiles a creature, providing solid removal. His ultimate is not really used in the deck, but can potentially end the game when used, although not really the main reason for running him. Basriket can not only put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures thanks to Agrus, but they would also gain indestructible until end of turn. This is one of those effects that help turn our board wipes one-sided. We first give all of our creatures indestructible before casting that Wrath of God, but more on that later. His -2 ability helps us further aggro out by creating a 1/1 attacker for each non-token creature we're attacking with. His -2 ability helps us further aggro out by creating a 1/1 attacker for each non-token creature we're attacking with. It's not that overpowering since we already saw that we can attack with a lot of token copies, but it's still good. His emblem is amazing to get, especially since we're mostly uptaking him anyways, so we're bound to get it. Elspeth Resplendent will not only play +1/+1 counter on potentially all of our creatures with her +1 ability, but she would also put either a flying, first strike, lifelink, or a vigilance counter on them too. Since it's her +1 ability, we can use it each turn to get a different counter on our army each time. Her -3 ability is useful to help filter through the top of our library, but should only be really used if we're running out of gas. Her ultimate is very easy to achieve if we're spamming her +1 ability. Getting 5 3/3s with flying in an aggro deck is no joke. As for just +1/+1 counters, Luminarch Aspirant, Neil's Disciplined Enforcer, Power Conduit, and Thundering Raiju help us out with that. Best of all, none of these require investing any kind of mana to do so, so it just costs 2 mana to give all of our creatures a +1/+1 counter. Some of these also do additionally useful things like Nils and Thundering Raiju. While Nils can be used politically, he's still useful even if we only give counters to our own creatures. Because if an opponent's putting counters of their own on their own creatures, it makes it harder to attack us with them. So he's still useful and cheap to cast. Thundering Raiju can help end the game much faster since it's dealing X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of modified creatures we control. Given how many ways the deck has to put counters on all of our creatures, X will not be a small amount. Idyllic Grange and Rustic Cackling also put a +1/+1 counter on our creatures without really taking up a slot in the deck, assuming you're not greedy as you play and use them as lands when you need them as lands. Rustic Cackling can be discarded for 2 mana to give a +1/+1 counter to Agrus, so for just 4 mana total and discarding a land, we can give a +1/+1 counter to all of our creatures at instant speed. Since it's not a spell, it can be countered, only Stifle. Idyllic Grange will only give the +1/+1 counter if it enters the battlefield untapped, but the deck has plenty of fetch lands that can get it, so we can do this at instant speed by fetching for it whenever we want those +1/+1 counters, either in response to damage, blocks, or at the beginning of the end step before ours. Citadel Siege and Living Armor are more ways to give buff counters but provide more than just one at a time. The enchantment can't be used at instant speed, but it does provide 2 +1/+1 counters at the beginning of combat on our turn if we choose the cons mode. Living Armor doesn't quite work as worded here and has been errated to put X plus 0 plus 1 counters on the creature instead of 1 plus 0 plus X counter. That being said, it's an amazing way to help protect our blockers and attackers since they're getting toughness counters equal to their mana value all at instant speed for just tapping, sacrificing it, and having 2 mana at the ready for Agrus. Karn's Bastion is an obvious include in the deck since proliferating those +1/+1 counters and even +0/+1 counters on a card that doesn't even take up a slot in the deck is golden. The deck can be a bit mana heavy, but if we have nothing else to do, then sinking it into Karn's Bastion is fine. Especially since we can also proliferate loyalty counters on our planeswalkers. Avenging Huntbonder, Sanctuary Smasher, and Splendor Mare do something similar to Elspeth Resplendent in that they give keyword counters to our creatures. The first one gives a double strike counter to another target attacking creature whenever it attacks. So, you guessed it, whenever we attack with all of our creatures, targeting Agrus and paying 2 means giving all of those attackers a double strike counter. The last two are great because they give their respective keyword counter when being cycled away. Not only are we getting that first strike or lifelink counter, but we're drawing a card too. This can be done at instant speed and can't be countered, only stifled. The rest of the boon effects in the deck are temporary, but just because they go away at the beginning of the end step doesn't mean they're not busted thanks to Agrus. Ajani Steadfast, Elspeth, Knight Errant, Gideon Blackblade, and Jessica Thrice Reborn do some serious work just like the previously mentioned Planeswalkers. These round out all of the Planeswalkers of the deck, so let's get into it. Ajani can potentially give all of our creatures +1/+1, first strike, vigilance, and lifelink until end of turn, really helping us aggro out. Not only can we gain a ton of life from an alpha strike, but our creatures are left untapped to protect from the clapback. His -2 does actually put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures, but we don't really have to lose loyalty for that. Giving a loyalty counter to all of our planeswalkers though, could be helpful in having them ultimate earlier. Speaking of, his emblem is absolutely insane here since it'll make it so all of our creatures and planeswalkers would only take 1 damage regardless of how much over that they'd normally take. This is definitely an emblem worth getting. Elspeth can potentially give all of our creatures +3/+3 and flying until end of turn, which can definitely help us alpha strike for the win. Her other +1 can also slowly but surely grow our army, but she's mostly used for her second ability. Well, and for her emblem too. It takes a while to get there, but having an emblem giving indestructible to our artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands is definitely worth getting in an aggro deck like this one. Gideon will always be animated during our turn, so we don't have to waste a loyalty activation to do that, giving us yet another attacker that's indestructible too. His +1 ability would unfortunately not target him even with Agrus, but that won't stop the rest of our army from getting either Vigilance, Lifelink, or Indestructible until end of turn. So this is yet another way to make Wrath effects one-sided for just 2 mana. His ultimate is quite costly to get there, but being able to snipe any non-land permanent in a pinch is still amazing to have. Lastly, Jessica is absolutely busted here. Her 0 loyalty ability can potentially make our army deal thrice as much damage to a player whenever they receive combat damage. That alone warrants a spot for her here. If that weren't enough, we can use her -X ability to deal X damage to up to 3 targets in a pinch. So good. Paladin, Class, and Steel Seraph also give temporary keyword effects on combat. While the Angel can be cast for its prototype cost as a smaller version, blinking it will naturally have it return as the big version, so we do have that going for us. Paladin Class is such an epic card here though. It provides a stacks effects for free, but when we take it to level 2, it gives a global boon to all of our creatures. But its level 3 is where it's at. If we swing in with all of our creatures and target Agrus with it, all of our creatures will essentially get +S+X, where X is the number of other attacking creatures, plus they all gain double strike. This thing ends games. Power Matrix and Stirring Bard also have the potential of ending games. For no additional mana investment, Power Matrix gives +1/+1, flying, first strike, and trample until end of turn. Definitely the makings of potential game-ending alpha strike material. The Bard gives haste and menace until end of turn, also providing evasion of some sort. If that weren't enough, it's mostly included because it gives us the initiative when entering the battlefield. Thanks to that, we can venture through Undercity, which is great for non-green decks like this one. We can tutor for a basic land once we start it. From there, we can put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, which Agrus will love. Or we can scry 2 and then keep going right to create a treasure token if we're running out of gas. Or we can keep going to the left to have a player lose 5 life, making our aggro strategy easier. We can then draw a card and cheat a creature from the top 10 cards of our library at the end. Or if you continued right, create another evasive beater. This dungeon does it all. Slayer Stronghold and Sunhome Fortress of the Legion also do something similar but require mana and tapping to do so, really bumping up that mana investment. However, since they're lands that don't enter the battlefield tapped and can be tapped for mana, they don't take up slots in the deck. Giving Vigilance, Haste, and Double Strike respectively to our army is like to scoff at. However, we can really make our army get that game-ending alpha strike by making them unblockable. Key to the City, Rogue's Passage, Spirit End All, and Suspicious Bookcase do just that. Key to the City is a bit harder to do since it requires discarding a card, but at least we can pay 2 whenever it untaps to draw a card. Rogue's Passage doesn't take up a slot in the deck, and the price for that is paying 4 and tapping it along with Argus's 2 mana cost. Spirit End All can only be activated from our hand during our upkeep, but that's not really an issue. Most players don't run creatures with Shadow, so we're essentially getting an unblockable army for just 4 mana during our upkeep. This also makes it harder to deal with since it's not a spell, so it can only be stifled. The bookcase can be telegraphed, but most of the cards in the deck are permanents anyways, which is great for when we resolve over the top, as mentioned near the beginning of the video. Okay, so now we saw how to multiply our army and pump it up to game-ending levels. How else do we protect it? Sure, we saw a handful of indestructible effects, but those were a bonus to other effects. Well, the deck is running plenty of protective effects to protect our board from opponents as well as ourselves. Darker Valkyrie and Cauldron of Souls are amazing at recovering our creatures both from board wipes as well as combat damage. With the way the Valkyrie is worded, we can tap it, targeting Agrus, and then give that same delayed effect to all of our other creatures. Unfortunately, it can't protect itself, but at least it auto-reanimates our board. The Cauldron doesn't need Agrus, and we can just target all of our creatures with it. With so many effects that give +1/+1 counters to all of our creatures, this essentially gives us an Eternal army along with its Eternal commander. Cold Storage, like Scarab of the Unseen, is another obscure card that will get you hipster points for running. In response to a board wipe that either destroys, exiles, or bounces all of our creatures, we can activate it for 3 and pay 2 to Agrus's ability to exile all of our creatures to it. We can then sacrifice it later on when the coast is clear to get all of our creatures back. This card is amazing here. Deathless Angel and Kythian Hero of Agrus give actual indestructible to our creatures. The Angel is a bit hefty at 6 mana to cast, but for just 2 mana plus Agrus's 2 mana, we can make our board indestructible at will at instant speed for just 4 mana. It's also a 5/7 flyer, which is nothing to scoff at. Kythian only gives indestructible to himself, but the point of running him is to transform him into Gideon Battleforged. With his +1 loyalty ability, we can give indestructible to potentially our entire army. His +2 is pretty useful as well, since it forces a creature to attack Gideon, which we can then block. So this is amazing removal against utility creatures, so keep that in mind as well. And for nothing else, we can also animate him with his final loyalty ability if we want another body to swing with. Giver of Runes and Mother of Runes being included in the deck should be no surprise. These runes are quite blessing since getting protection at instant speed is always clutch. Not only do they protect our creatures from targeted removal, but protection also means being unable to be blocked. So we can also use them proactively as well as reactively, making them yet another way to give a form of unblockability to our army. Aura's Semi-Guardian and Semi-Blessing also provide protection in the sense of preventing damage dealt. Aura's is amazing here since it's a way of making our creatures potentially indestructible in combat, as well as from direct damage effects like Blasphemous Act. Semi-Blessing is an interesting aura since it basically turns enchanted creature into auras. The best part of this effect is that we don't target the source, we simply choose it. So we can target Agrus as the only target and then pay 2 to prevent that damage to our other creatures as well. Amazing. Ameri the Skyruin and Mistveiled Plains are lands that also provide some form of defensive interaction. Since they're on lands, they don't take up slots in the deck. Mistveiled Plains is tutorable, which makes it even better. Ameria actually reanimates a creature from our graveyard, but Mistveiled Plains bottom decks the card from our graveyard. This is so useful since fetch lands shuffle the deck, giving us an opportunity to recover any key cards. That being said, there are so many redundant effects in the deck that no singular card is unique enough to worry about losing. Lastly, one of the most busted protective effects in the deck is Oblivion Stone. That's because it's not really protective but destructive. This card is absolutely insane with Agrus. The stone is supposed to be a way to either slowly give our permanents fate counters to then wipe the board of everything else. However, thanks to Agrus, we can give all of our creatures a fate counter for a total investment of 6 mana. Then the next turn we could wipe all other non-land permanents for just 5 mana. This artifact is absolutely busted here. Speaking of wiping the board, let's see the rest of the deck's interaction, card advantage, and mana acceleration pieces. Red-white isn't as powerful as the other colors in most of these categories, but the deck makes do. Blasphemous Act, Vanquish the Horde, Day of Judgment, and Wrath of God are absolutely backbreaking when cast after giving our creatures indestructible. The first two in particular since their cost can be significantly reduced, making it easier to protect our board first before casting them. In any case, it's always good to have board wipes in a deck, even a creature-heavy deck like this one. You have no guarantee that your opponent won't have a more oppressive or scarier board than yours. So if you do have to push the red button, do it. Overloading Vandal Blast helps wipe opponents' boards of their artifacts. While the previous 4 are about creatures, we still need ways to deal with other archetypes, or just wipe out everything with our Revelation and Ondu Inversion. Last thing we need is getting stuck behind a wall of Pillow Fort effects preventing us from aggroing off. Stacks effects aren't that problematic against us since we're not really casting many spells per turn, but Pillow Forts are quite annoying to aggro decks. Best of all, Undo Inversion doesn't take up a slot in the deck since its backside is a land. Assuming of course you play it as a land when you need it as a land. Don't be greedy with MDFC lands and utility lands. Chaos Warp and Generous Gift are naturally included for those spot removal cases that need to be dealt with, especially since these can target lands which might be important to do given the situation. As for how we don't run out of steam and are able to draw into these cards, the deck's running Tome of Legends, Wedding Ring, Sanctuary Warden, and War Room. While we do have the potential to draw into a ton of cards thanks to Skyra of the Unseen and Jaxis, we still need more card draw effects. Since the deck is so aggro, Tome of Legends does a good job of getting a page counter on it more often than not, so we can definitely draw a card once per turn around the table if we wanted to. Wedding Ring is absolutely busted to give to the blue player. We don't draw cards if they're drawing cards outside of their turn, but they're still the best player to give it to. This helps us out a ton, and finally the card has significantly dropped in price on the secondary market since it first came out. Sanctuary Warden gives us value when attacking since there'll almost always be a counter on one of our creatures. It even answers with 2 shield counters on itself, which will work if nothing else. In any case, drawing a card and creating another body for removing a counter from one of our creatures is amazing. Best of all, it's a 5/5 flyer, so we're not going to mind attacking with it anyways. War Room is another one of those cards that don't take up a slot in the deck, and its inclusion is pretty self-explanatory. As for how we're going to get that mana to power the deck, Soul Bright Flamekin is absolutely busted in an Agrus deck. Thanks to how this ability works with Agrus, we only need a 3rd creature in play, in other words just 1 more, in order to get that 8 red mana. So for just 4 mana, we can get 8 red mana back once per turn. This mana can be spent to further fuel Agrus' ability with other abilities that turn. This is definitely an all-star here. Professional Facebreaker is another way to make easy mana in the deck given its aggressive nature. Keep in mind that we do have to have at least 1 attacker get through per opponent in order to maximize how much trigger we get per combat. If that weren't enough, we can sacrifice a treasure to impulsive draw the top card of our library, making this a card advantage piece as well. Court Cartographer, Solemn Simulacrum, and Stoic Farmer are amazing mana acceleration pieces, even if they are slow compared to Green's cards. However, since they ramp a land to the battlefield, blinking and or copying these enough times will definitely help us get ahead, potentially more so than the green player at the table. Sword of the Animus and Sword of Hearth and Home also help with that since the deck is so aggro. Ramping for a land each turn gives us a huge advantage. If that weren't enough, Sword of Hearth and Home is another blink effect. If we target Agrus, we can pay 2 to blink not just him, but all of our creatures as well. Blinking any of the previously 3 ramp creatures will really make those green players green with envy. Wayfarer's Bauble, Navigation Orb, and Canoptic Wraith are more ways of getting basic lands onto the battlefield, but are unfortunately one-time use only effects essentially. At least the Wraith is straight up unblockable, so it can also just be used as a guaranteed beater each turn. Filling this with +1/+1 counters, keyword effects, etc. will definitely make it quite dangerous. And then, in response to removal, sacrifice it for value. So good. Lastly, Soul Ring is obviously included in the deck. It is the only mana rock in the deck though, since all of the mana acceleration pieces are basically ramping us for basic lands, which is the best kind of generic mana acceleration anyways. But these effects are also consequentially good in the deck regardless. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 8 fetch lands, Sacred Foundry, Sacred Peaks, Alpine Meadow, Rugged Prairie, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 6 basic plains, 2 basic mountains, and 1 waste to help out with Eldrazi's Displacer. Again, there are other colorless mana sources in the deck, but waste is fetchable, so it's worth it to run at least 1 copy in the deck, which is one reason Prismatic Vista is included with the fetch lands. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Agrus Kos Eternal Soldier. There are so many cards to choose from when building Agrus. In fact, if you do check out the deck list to my own build for him, you're going to see some cards I considered that I cut when playtesting with the deck. However, they were still pretty good when they did work, so I left them there to serve for more inspiration in how to build around Agrus. So if you are interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. Thanks to the results of last week's poll, all of my deck lists will now be on Moxfield going forwards, so thanks for your input. Finally, I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Embedded Kirby, and happy brewing.